Today we're going over everything you need to know to properly care for a leopard gecko. So this is going to be a complete care guide on everything I do to keep my leopard gecko happy and healthy. You might have noticed this isn't a leopard gecko. My cat's currently occupying the enclosure, but we don't really need to get to that yet. And first I have a couple little disclaimers. Firstly, there's more than one way to care for a leopard gecko. On every care guide you find, there's going to be a few little things that are different because there is more than one way to care for a leopard gecko properly. Some people say that what they do is the only way to do it, when I definitely disagree with that. But of course there are incorrect ways to do things. Some things they do require, for example, every leopard gecko needs some sort of heat source, but the way you heat their enclosure is different according to different people, and you have multiple options that will work just fine. But we'll get into all those details later. And the next thing I want to say is I'm going off of the GoHerping Leopard Gecko Care Guide to make sure I don't miss anything. If you want to go read everything out, along with finding this video and some other information, you can go to goherping.com/leopardgeckos, and a full written out care guide with everything I'll be going over here will also be right there, and you can check back to that whenever you need some info. But we can go ahead and get right into it. Firstly, we're going to be talking about the enclosure. Lots of people house their leopard geckos differently. Some use aquariums like this, while some use actual enclosures made for reptiles. Others use tubs, others use rack systems. Personally, I don't like using tubs or rack systems, even though they can potentially work. But I'm going to be going with an aquarium, and this is a 20-gallon aquarium. I'd say for a single leopard gecko, you need it to be about 15 to 20 gallons so that it has a bit of space, but at the same time, it's not too large to where it's uncomfortable and can get stressed out because there's just so much empty space. If you plan on keeping more than one leopard gecko in the same enclosure, I suggest that you add about 10 gallons for each gecko. So if you have two geckos and if you have one gecko in a 20-gallon and you want to get another, you probably want to upgrade them to at least a 30-gallon, maybe even a 40-gallon. If you have 3 leopard geckos, then you probably want a 50 or 60-gallon. An important thing to keep in mind is male leopard geckos will generally tend to fight and maybe even kill one another because they're very territorial. Then of course a male and female are probably going to end up breeding during breeding season, so you might end up with some eggs. And then housing females together is going to be your best bet if you do want to keep multiple together. It's important to keep a close eye on them to make sure they are both staying healthy, both staying happy, and that they're not bothering one another, to make sure neither of them undergo any stress. It's not a bad idea to get a top for your enclosure if it is an aquarium like this. Leopard geckos, unlike a lot of snakes, can actually push the tops off of these enclosures, which is why I usually want some kind of latch or latching system, but leopard geckos aren't going to be tall enough to reach the top and push this, so a lid like this is probably going to be just fine. Before we move on to the specifics, let's go over all of the supplies I'm going to be using, and if you want to duplicate my setup exactly, these are the things that you're going to need. 3 bowls, 1 for water, 1 for food, and 1 for calcium. 2 to 3 hides, at least 1 being dry and 1 being humid. 1 or more heat sources. To manage the heat sources, a thermostat will come in very handy. Some sort of substrate or lining. Calcium, multivitamins, and potentially a water conditioner. So there's quite a bit of supplies. You don't necessarily need all that stuff. Some things you can just pick from, and some other things you might do differently. But we can go ahead and start talking about the substrates. So you've got 2 main categories of substrates. There's the loose substrates, and then there's basically the, solid substrates, like reptile carpet and paper towel. This is reptile carpet. It's my favorite to use with my leopard gecko. It's basically a big sheet of this carpet sort of material, but it's made for actual reptiles. You can find it in a lot of colors and varieties, and they're already usually cut to shape to fit certain sizes. For example, this one is for a 20-gallon. If you want to go a bit cheaper route but don't want to use a loose substrate, you can go with something like paper towel, which works just fine. The downside of reptile carpet is you do have to wash it out. Once they poop on it or if they spill things on it, it's going to need to be cleaned and sanitized to make sure your animal doesn't get sick. It's not too hard. Usually what I do is just stick it in some sort of container with water, maybe add a few drops of mild soap, just let it soak in there for a while, maybe scrub it a bit, and then rinse it out really well with just water and let it dry. I'm going to go ahead and put this in because it is what I'm going to be using today. So loose substrates are another option, and if you don't know what I mean by that, I basically mean it's some sort of bedding that has lots of little particles. Some examples are like cypress bark or aspen chips or coconut husk and all sorts of different things. You're gonna hear a lot of different opinions on what I'm about to say, but I personally highly recommend that you never use sand, calci sand, walnut shells, pine or cedar products. All these things can be very dangerous for different reasons, but I've already gone over those things in separate videos. Again, lots of people do use sand with leopard geckos. However, there's always that worry that your animal could get impaction. If you don't know what impaction is, I also have a full video explaining impaction and why I never use sand. All these different videos will be linked below, so you can pause it and learn about the different things as we go. If you end up deciding you do want a loose substrate, I would say Eco Earth or some sort of other coconut fiber is the best way to go because it is digestible, it's easy to clean, you can actually keep plants in it, and all sorts of things. Another option you have is Excavator clay. I've never used it, but it looks pretty cool. It's basically something that starts out powdery and then you add water and it turns into this clay sort of thing. You can mold it to the enclosure however you want, and then you let it dry so it's like this rocky sort of clay substrate. It works great with leopard geckos because they can't get impacted from it, and it just all around looks pretty nice, and it's probably not the easiest to clean, but it is manageable. So next we're going to actually jump over to temperature and humidity. We don't actually have any of the other stuff in here, but some of the things are going to be placed based on how you're managing the temperatures and humidities in your enclosure. First, we can get humidity out of the way, and leopard geckos don't actually need a very specific humidity in their enclosure because later we're going to talk about something called a humidity hide or a moist box or whatever people call them, but it's basically going to be this hide that they can go if they need a more humid place. You don't want their humidity in the enclosure to get too high though. Generally, you really don't want it to go above 30 or 40% because the humidity too high means that there's a lot of moisture in the air and that can get them actually sick or cause problems with their skin. It's really easy to keep their humidity right around 30% because most people's houses are at about 20 to 40% anyway. You really just need to make sure you don't spray down the enclosure, and if it is getting too humid, it's possible that it's because it's in your basement or something else, but there's other ways to cut out humidity, and I've already talked about this in another video on increasing and decreasing humidity, so you can go watch that video. Next we got the temperature, and this is quite an important thing for your leopard gecko. Because leopard geckos, like all reptiles, are cold-blooded, you're going to want some sort of spectrum of temperature. The hottest spot being about 85 to 90 degrees, while the coolest side can drop down to about 75. This allows them to thermoregulate, which means that they can basically control their temperature based on where they are in the enclosure, since they don't have warm blood that actually manages their body heat. There's multiple ways you can get the enclosure's hot spot up to about 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The first way being with a heat pad, which I already have on the bottom of the enclosure. This one sticks on. I can't take it off, so I can't really show you, but I do have another heat pad right here. It's best to stick this to the bottom of your enclosure because leopard geckos really love getting that belly heat. They might sleep on this, they might just be on it during the day, but it's a place that they can go and warm up. To make sure you get the right one, just look at what it says on what enclosure it's for. For example, this one I believe is for a 5 to 10 gallon, so just make sure you get the right size heat pad for the enclosure that you're using. It's not a bad idea to get a reptile thermostat so that you can actually regulate the temperature very specifically and very easily. I've got this right here. The instructions on how to use it will come in the box, but basically you just plug it in to any outlet, and then you plug the actual heat source into this, and with this you can control what temperature the enclosure will be. So if I want it to be about 87, I can just put it to 87 and it'll turn that heat source on and off as it goes up and down right around 87 degrees. Then at night, if I want to turn it down, I can simply turn it down, it'll let it cool off, and then once it goes under that 75 degrees, it'll just keep turning on and off to keep it the right temperature. So I highly recommend using a heat pad because they really do enjoy that belly heat so much. But if you can't achieve the right temperature with just that, you might want to get something like a ceramic bulb, because all this does is generate heat and not any light. You really want to avoid lights at night for leopard geckos, but I've talked about the lights that they can and can't see in another video, so you can go check that out. But the ceramic bulbs can be used during the day and at night, and you can hook this up to the thermostat too. Of course, you're going to need some sort of dome like I have on my ball python right here. It just goes in here, but you need to make sure it can actually manage the temperature. This is a 100-watt bulb, so you're going to need a really strong dome for it, and it's going to be best if the end is ceramic so that it doesn't melt or get too hot. You can find links to this stuff in the description. I have it all marked out so you can get exactly what I'm using. A great way to measure the temperatures in your enclosure is with a temp gun. Unlike a gauge, you don't have to wait to see what the temperature is. All you do is point the gun at a spot and pull the trigger. It can immediately tell you what the temperature is in Fahrenheit or Celsius, so it's a great way to get exact temperatures in exact spots. So those are the two ways I suggest that you heat the enclosure. Somewhat relating to heat is lighting. Leopard geckos are nocturnal or crepuscular depending on who you ask. Crepuscular being that they're active during the dawn and dusk hours, and then nocturnal of course is at night. So with that said, they can be bothered by light, but they do need some sort of light source. I've talked about whether leopard geckos do need light or not in other videos, but basically they do need at least just about 12 hours of light and then 12 hours of dark so that they know when it's daytime and when it's nighttime. Because just because they're nocturnal doesn't mean that they shouldn't know what time of day it is. It's like if it was always daytime for people, we wouldn't know when to get sleep. Of course we have clocks, but leopard geckos don't. So now that we've talked about the heat, the humidity, and the lighting, we can keep adding stuff to this enclosure. Next, we're going to talk about hides. So as you saw before, I'm actually using two hides. The first being just a usual hide that doesn't really let light in, and this is just a place for your gecko to feel safe. I recommend putting this over the heat pad so that they can go and basically hide while at the same time staying warm. Because if they are exposed to the light and they know that they can be seen, they might get kind of stressed out because they think they might be able to get eaten or attacked or something while they're trying to warm up. So my heat pad is right here. I'm going to put this on the pad. You might just want to put it on about half the heat pad so then they can be cool but at the same time be enclosed under this and feel safe. Next, I've got this plastic thing, and it's actually just a Tupperware with a top, and this is what's usually called a humidity hide. This is the place your gecko is going to go when it's shedding, because like all reptiles, they do shed, and they're going to need higher humidity to shed easily and not get stuck in their shed or anything. To do this, you're going to want to fill some sort of container or hide, but I recommend using plastic because it holds humidity better, and then cutting some sort of hole in it for your animal to get in. If you do decide to use plastic, plastic can be sharp, so you might need to melt the edges down or sand them down or put tape over them or something so that your gecko doesn't actually cut itself on this. Then I'm personally going to use paper towel, but you can also use eco earth, you could use moss, you can use all sorts of things, but you want to put this at the bottom of your thing and then you're going to moisten this. I just have a spray bottle here. You could probably even just pour a little bit of water in here, but this water in here with the cover on top is going to keep it nice and humid. I don't actually know, but I'll take a guess that this is probably like 80 to 90% humidity in here, and that's just fine because they can leave it when they aren't shedding or when they don't need that high humidity. You can just stick this enclosure basically anywhere in there. The humidity is probably going to be a bit higher if you keep it to the warmer side because hot air plus water means that there's going to be more evaporation and more humidity, but it's not too bad if you put it on the cool side. You just might need to spray it a bit more often to keep it nice and humid. Next up, we've got the bowls, and you saw that I actually have 3 bowls, and I'll explain what each of these bowls are for. The first one simply being water. Of course, every animal is going to need access to water, and leopard geckos really don't need that big of a bowl because they never actually need to soak. They also can get stuck in water bowls, so you need to make sure that it's shallow enough that they can actually climb out if they somehow fall in or slip in or something while they're getting a drink or walking by or whatever. I've got this small bowl here. It's more than enough to keep him hydrated, and at the same time he can easily climb out if he decides to hop in here. But now we're going to talk about the actual water that I use. I highly recommend that you don't actually use tap water because it can contain chlorine, and it's just little bits of chlorine in tap water, so it's not going to hurt us. Reptiles are more sensitive to it. However, there are many easy ways to remove the chlorine from this. You can go find this at goherping.com/leopardgeckos, so I won't go into all the details, but the easiest way that I found, just my personal preference, is by using Reptisafe Drop. Because I have quite a few reptiles that I need to get water for, I buy it in this really big jug, but you can also get it in really small amounts if you only have a few animals. You just follow the directions on here, just add the correct number of drops per water, and it immediately removes that chlorine and stuff. There are other processes you can do yourself, but like I said, you can go find all those at goherping.com/leopardgeckos. Next up, we'll talk about the other 2 bowls, both of which are food related. So first we can go over the actual food. I put this in a larger bowl. Really all the gecko needs is something that it can actually reach into. I use a plastic one. I don't really recommend the plastic ones because he always steps on it and then it flips upwards like into his face, so I have to put a rock or something in there. But it does work. You're probably better if you get some sort of like ceramic or rock one. But anyway, you do have multiple choices with leopard geckos. They are completely carnivorous, and more specifically, they're all insectivores. So all they need is some sort of insect, along with some calcium and supplements, which I'll talk about in just a sec. I would definitely say the most popular insect people choose is crickets, because they're like super widely available, they're pretty cheap and everything, but they're not the most nutritious. You can definitely use them, they'll definitely work, but there are more nutritious options. The next up I'd probably say is mealworms, which is what I use. They're very cheap, you can get them in bulk, they last a long time, and they work just fine. Leopard geckos and a lot of other animals can be really healthy with them. Then on the top, it's really not even an argument. Everyone pretty much knows that dubia roaches are the most popular. This isn't used as often because they are also a lot more expensive. On top of this, a lot of people just don't want roaches in their house. But yeah, right now I'm using mealworms, and you only need one insect. You really don't need variety, but variety is always good, so you could definitely use it. There are some insects that you should avoid. For example, waxworms and superworms are very high in fat. If your gecko is underweight, or if you're going to be breeding or something, you might want to get their fat content higher, so you want to use these, but you're not going to want to use one of those on like a daily or weekly basis. You're going to want to stick to something with a little bit more nutrition and less fat, like dubias, crickets, or mealworms. You really don't need to be too specific on how much you give them. I'm just going to fill my leopard gecko's bowl. This is probably about 15, and you can really just keep their bowl full because they only eat until they get full. If you do notice that your gecko is getting kind of fat, and if it's like developing any fat rolls or looking chubbier than your average gecko, you might want to start cutting it back. If your gecko is looking kind of underweight, you might want to switch to something with a bit more fat, or simply feed them more. If their bowl is always empty, then you're probably also going to want to feed them more. However, you do need to give them more than just the insect. The first, probably the most important, being calcium. You can get calcium from a ton of different companies. The container is going to last you a long time because there's a lot in here, and really all you just have to do is open this up and dust your insects with it. You can either sprinkle it directly on them or dust them in some sort of bag, like put the insects in a little plastic bag, put some of this, shake it around, and then put it in here. I just sprinkle it directly on top of them, and it works just fine. I can just mix them up, and then I can just put the bowl in. So this calcium is really important. It's not something that you want to forget, and it's really not an optional thing. You want their bones to grow well. That's what calcium's for. If you don't give them enough calcium and other supplements, they could have different sorts of bone problems. For example, MBD, which is metabolic bone disease, and it's something that's way too common because it's really easily avoidable as long as you're giving your animals the proper lighting. Geckos, however, do not need that lighting because they are not diurnal. Next up is the multivitamin. This contains a ton of different vitamins. It's like way too many to list right here. I'm using Herptivite, made by Reptile, and it's made for all reptiles and amphibians. However, you don't want to give this to them as often. So what people do is you want to cycle it with the calcium. So the most common thing people do is, say you feed your gecko 4 times a week. 3 of those times you're going to want to use calcium, while 1 of those times you're going to want to use the Herptivite. Personally, I do 2 times calcium, 1 time Herptivite because I feed them 3 times a week. It really doesn't need to be too specific, but you definitely don't want them to get as much multivitamin as they're getting calcium because you don't want them to basically, I guess, almost overdose on this. But I'd probably say about 3 to 5 calcium feedings to every 1 multivitamin feeding, and that will keep your animal healthy. This is just a powder. It's a bit different color, but it's practically the same texture and everything as the calcium. Your animal really shouldn't notice it, and it might even like it. Next, we've got this third little bowl, and what I do with this is something that a lot of people do, and it definitely doesn't hurt, and it's basically just to put calcium in. There's actually other animals, like you can do this with some mammals too, where you basically just always leave calcium available because they're able to basically detect when they don't have enough. They can just go and lick this up, and then they'll stop when they think they've gotten enough. You can just keep this little bowl full, and I can't get my calcium open. There we go. I just take it, sprinkle a bit in, fill it up like every week or so, which is enough for him, and then I just stick it near the bowl so he can go find that whenever he needs it. So his enclosure is basically good to go. This is Goldie, my giant leopard gecko. I'm gonna go ahead and let him go hang out in his enclosure, and he'll be good to go. So we've gone over the enclosure, the temperature and humidity, the substrates, the hides, the water, the food, and then the supplements, and that should be just about it. I'll go ahead and stick the top on here. and now he's right at home with everything that he needs to stay healthy. So the enclosure's all set up now. Some things to keep in mind is you should try and replace the water as often as possible. It would be great if you replace it daily. If not, I would say replace it at least like 3 to 5 times a week to make sure it's always clean and safe for them. And then there's the feeding. You can basically just keep their bowl full whenever. If you don't, just make sure they have enough, and you can replace them with new food every so often. Then you want to add the calcium and the supplements. Like I said, the calcium, it should be about 3 to 5 calcium feedings per 1 multivitamin feeding to make sure they have a balanced vitamin diet. If you find your animal doesn't like a certain food and it's not eating, you might want to try some other insects. Like if you tried crickets but they don't like them, maybe try mealworms and try dubias, and even try superworms and waxworms to see what they do and don't eat. If you just recently got your gecko and it's not eating or something and it's maybe more skittish, you just need to let it get used to the environment, maybe for a couple days, and it's normal for them to not eat for a little bit. But yeah, that's everything I've got for you for the complete leopard gecko setup and care. I think I covered everything. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask in the comments. I'll try and reply to as many as I can. And again, there is more than one way to care for a leopard gecko, like there is with a lot of reptiles. Just because you see someone doing it one way doesn't mean that that's the only way you can keep a gecko happy and healthy, because there's multiple different ways people have tried and done that have worked out just fine. I definitely recommend that you go find some other care guides to see what information you can compare to make sure you're giving them the best care possible. And again, you can go to goherping.com/leopardgeckos to see everything written out. In case you don't want to have to come back to this video and find certain spots, you can just see everything right there, along with finding this video there. But that's it. Hopefully it helped out. You can check out some other complete care guides along with plenty of other videos on the GoHerping channel and the GoHerping website. If you go and sign up for the newsletter, you can get a weekly email with different updates and stuff, and you can consider subscribing if you want to see new videos. But that's it for this video. I'm Alex, and thanks for watching.